All right, so now we're going to continue our discussion of the 20th century. We're going to talk about the rise and fall of communism and the global conflict known as the Cold War, which wasn't cold at all. There were lots of hot spots in the war. We're going to talk about all of these conflicts that lead to change throughout the 20th century and into the 21st. Of course, one of the most important changes of this period is the growth of communism as a global force. And communism is based upon our interpretation is based on the works of 19th century philosopher named Karl Marx. And Marx believed that basically industrialization and capitalism led to increasing exploitation of the working class, which would eventually result in the overthrow of the capitalist system and the development of a classless, egalitarian, utopian society. And he believed, basically, he called it kind of the end of history, and that once the revolution occurred, that basically the state would wither away and there would be no need for that. Ironically, the Marxist revolutions that happen in the name of communism are all mostly in lightly industrialized, mostly agrarian places. Russia, China, Korea, Vietnam, and Cuba all actually go against the theories of Marx, which are based on industrialism. However, they establish regimes that at least they believe were based upon Marx's ideas. In Western Europe, the United States, Southeast Asia, and other places, there are communist parties that developed and ran candidates for elections, and they were also part of the global communist movement, but never really gained a lot of power. And communism is different from other political systems in the fact that it is specifically, explicitly international and anti-nationalist. Communism, at its root, believes that ideas of nation and other constructs which divide people just work to divide the workers and prevent the rise of the working class. However, when communist parties come to power, they often act like typical states. You have conflicts break out between the Soviet Union and the states that it treats basically like colonies in Eastern Europe. I mean, it more or less treats Eastern Europe as colonized regions, exploiting their resources for the benefit of the Soviet Union, etc. It's also true in conflicts between the Soviet Union and China later on. And of course, the most common path for communism to rise is revolution. When we look at Russia, 1917 is really kind of a year that is the year that communism becomes a thing. So the Romanovs collapsed in 1917, terrible leadership during the war, as well as corruption in the government and widespread economic inequality at home basically leads to the collapse of the Tsarist government in February 1917. The provisional government that takes control basically faces a lot of the same problems as the Tsarist state, and they continue fighting in World War I. And this basically makes people even more upset with the provisional government than maybe they'd even been for the Tsars, which opens the way for the Bolsheviks, led by Lenin, to take power in a coup in October of 1917. So the February Revolution that overthrew the Tsar, then the October Revolution that overthrew the provisional government. Now, Vladimir Lenin, who was the leader of the Bolshevik movement, kind of goes against Marxist orthodoxy in Russia. It wasn't fully yet industrialized, and so he argued that Russia would serve as a socialist beachhead, kind of a place where the global revolution would begin. And while the Bolsheviks controlled the capital and a few cities, they still had to fight a civil war to consolidate their power against the whites, or the White Army, the anti-Bolshevik forces. And the violence of the war caused Lenin's government to become more and more authoritarian. Eventually, they changed their name officially to the Communist Party. They do win over many supporters with their social reforms and opportunities, but in the end, the defeat of their rivals and establishment of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR, also known as the Soviet Union, results in the establishment of a much more authoritarian type government than Marx would have recognized. The USSR remains the lone island of communism until after the Second World War. Faced with the American effort to extend influence in Eastern Europe, Stalin begins imposing Communist Party-run governments in Eastern Europe. Yugoslavia was also communist, but not under Stalin's control. Joseph Tito, who was the leader of communist Yugoslavia, was able to maintain his own authority there. We see a lot of differences with the revolution in China, however, because the Chinese Communist Party didn't have a real socialist, or the China did not have a big socialist imprint up until much later. In fact, they didn't have a Communist Party until 1921. Also different, whereas the Russian government basically overthrew a feeble and ineffective government, the provisional government, the Chinese Communist Party faced a larger, very equipped Chinese Nationalist Party called the Kuomintang, and it was led by a experienced officer by the name of Chiang Kai-shek, or Zhang Jixi. The Nationalists enjoyed the financial support of not only the landowning classes and industrialists, but also from outside sources throughout the world. So Zhang launched a campaign of anti-communist terror that nearly destroyed the Communist Party in China. However, the Chinese Communist Party goes on what's known as a long march, basically looking for a safe place, trying to avoid annihilation. And what happens is, as they go through all these small villages, they begin to consolidate support among the peasants. So they work with the peasantry and exploit tensions between peasants and landlords. They also build bridges, roads, dams, things of that nature, and this helps them formulate a peasant-based guerrilla fighting force. And they also gain years of crucial experience governing the provinces and village, which has been a constant problem for all Chinese governments, but especially for the Chinese nationalists. The Chinese Communist Party also makes a lot of inroads with women. They had been exploiting the peasant landowner conflicts, but they also basically were challenging certain aspects of the rural patriarchy, which were very strong in China at the time. This attracted a lot of women. The thing that really creates the Chinese Communist Party as powerful, though, is the Japanese invasion in 1937. So the Chinese Communist Party, because it was a guerrilla warfare because its soldiers were very good at guerrilla warfare, were actually more effective in fighting the Japanese. The nationalists, because they were conventional military force, were pretty much powerless to stop the much more technologically advanced, more powerful Japanese. So the Kuomintang, as they're pulling back, they're retreating, the communists are able to continue to operate even behind Japanese lines. And this lends more credibility to the communists. After World War II, the defeat of Japan, basically the CCP and the Kuomintang began fighting each other again, and eventually there's a victory by Mao's Chinese Communist Party in 1949. Basically, the remaining nationalists retreat to the island of Taiwan, which creates a whole nother political issue that still continues today. So basically, the Chinese Communist Party's victory comes from its base in the countryside, its track record of resistance to Japanese occupation, and the fact that it's just better organized, specifically in the provinces. One of the interesting parts of looking at how these different societies build these different communist governments build their societies is looking at the idea of feminism. And communist feminism takes many different roles. The early Soviet state enacts a series of reforms that give women full citizenship, better access to divorces, equal political and economic rights, and also establishes a department of the Soviet government that basically deals with women's issues, educates women, and encourages them to take new professional and public roles. Many male party members, however, resent this, and during Stalin's rule in the 30s, the woman question was declared solved, and the Zenodel was shut down. In China, you have the Women Can Do Anything movement that basically reforms marriage law to try to weaken the Confucian patriarchy. And they do face some opposition, but there was very little of the radicalism of the Zenodel in China. The party does succeed, however, in getting the women to play a much more active role outside the home. And so in the 1960s, the slogan, "Women can do anything," urged women to pursue all professions. So despite major gains for women in both societies, women really saw little reform of the family structure. So what really happens is they're often hit with the double burden of work in and outside the home. Another common challenge is making an industrial revolutionary ideology like Marxism fit with largely agricultural societies. So in 1917, you see peasants rise up and seize land from the landowners. The Bolsheviks basically had to accept it because they had no power to stop it, and kind of praise it as revolutionary. In China, the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, organizes the breakup of these landlord holdings after their victory against the Kuomintang. And basically, teams of trained party members go into the countryside and encourage peasants to publicly denounce the landowners. And as a result, 1 to 2 million landlords were actually slaughtered as a result of these actions. Both had to deal with the agricultural question differently. The Chinese Communist Party had a base in the peasantry, so they had they had support. The Soviets did not. So Stalin had to force the peasantry into collectivized farms between 1928 and 1933, and this resulted in massive protests and slaughtering of animals rather than turning them over to the collectives. He actually declared war on the wealthier peasants, calling them kulaks, killing some, deporting others, sending some to work camps in Siberia. As most of the party members from the city were hated by most peasants. They were seen as outsiders, as interlopers, and the process of collectivization under Stalin's leadership results in a famine that kills 5+ million people. The CCP, although they had a base in the peasantry, still disrupted a lot of markets and lives and social structures with their collectivization of agricultural lands as well. Combined with administrative chaos and bad weather, the collectivization of Chinese agriculture actually leads to an even larger famine than what we see in Russia, with the deaths of about 20 million people during the Great Leap Forward from 1959 to 1962. Now, while the communist governments seem to be an ill fit for their agricultural societies, both governments look to try to industrialize. They saw industrialization as the way to the modern future. So they both focused on in building industry through centrally planned economies. They both adopted the strategies of state ownership and a series of 5-year plans that privileged the growth of heavy industry, especially. And as a result, you had 3 main social changes that resulted in both countries. Large factories dominate the cities. Cities lived off food taken from the countryside, and you had a new rise of elite party bureaucrats, engineers, and managers that kind of rise to prominence. Stalin kind of accepts these social changes. Mao, however, saw them as a betrayal of the true communist path, and he wanted to return China to the ethics of its revolutionary period. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in our discussion of Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution in the next slide. And we're going to see how Mao's insistence on a purified communism are going to lead to lots of destruction. We'll see you in the next video. Bye.